You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 417 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show today is Will Porter. He, of course, is a staff writer at RT and has published articles at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and the Libertarian Institute. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, always glad to come back on. How you doing, Kyle?
I'm doing well, and I got, I think, important topics to talk about with you today. Some of the probably most important things that I talk about on the show: Assange, Syria, and Yemen, and probably three of the topics that we've covered most. Maybe leaving out Russiagate off one or two on that list. We've certainly covered Syria in a lot of detail, and so with the updates there, thought it was a great idea to have you back on the show, talk about some of the stuff that you're writing for RT, but also opinion pieces that you're putting out on your own. So let's start off here with Julian Assange. I know there's no, big news stories, something that's going to capture headlines that ain't mainstream, or probably even get a little article at like CNN or something like that. But what's happening right now with Julian Assange? His situation just seems so dire that I like, asking anybody I can to talk about it, just to keep this story fresh and in the news. And Will, I know you have some of the most recent, even smaller updates as to what's going on. So let's get into that.
Yeah. I know you've done a great job covering, the whole Assange saga on the show. I don't think there hasn't been a real major update in this situation. However, we do have, news. His father just recently visited him. And unfortunately, his father said after seeing his condition, he said that he's starting to come to terms with the possibility that his son may die in jail, that Julian Assange may actually not, make it out. He may never see freedom, just because of, the poor conditions. A UN rights expert as well recently, Nils Melzer, recently weighed in saying that, I actually have the quote here. He said, quote, Mr. Assange's continued exposure to arbitrariness and abuse may soon end up costing his life, unquote. And so this is the same guy who previously had said that Assange was undergoing psychological torture after he visited him in May. And so it does not seem good. Like, this is not a good sign, especially from Assange's father, indicating that his condition is worsening. And I think you covered too on the show a couple weeks ago when he appeared in court as part of his extradition case, and he could hardly even speak his own name and date of birth and stuff. And so I think that also kind of tells us his status right now, mentally or health wise. And of course, that in that hearing, his request for a delay in his proceedings was also denied. So regardless of how unwell he is, or regardless of how poor his health is, he's going to have to go through with these extradition hearings. And I think those start in earnest in February.
Yeah, one of the things I want to highlight is that he's still kept in this solitary confinement condition. And there's actually this really good write-up at ProPublica that I'll link to on the show notes page. And it's not the usual topic of the show, but basically what it is in California, they use suicide watch a lot to just put prisoners places. And so this particular woman was brought in on a charge that she knew would eventually be dropped. Her father, who had Alzheimer's, filed a false report. It had happened in the past. She knew it would be dropped, but the police officers were giving her a hard time. And so when they asked her, repeatedly if she had any ideas of, hurting herself, she eventually sarcastically answered yes, and spent a week in solitary confinement without, really any human contact during the time. But the article kind of highlights her story really well. And so I think it might be a good example of what Julian's probably going through. Just how, this woman spent the first day, yelling, I haven't got my phone call. The second day, she's just trying to, engage with anybody who will talk to her. At one point, she talks about, she noticed, I guess she could see a computer screen, and she was like, oh, your new puppy looks really nice, and the guard just turned the screen away. And so, imagine being deprived, human contact like that for an extended period of time. We know he has limited access to visitors and his lawyers. These cells that they keep prisoners like this in are small. I believe he doesn't have access to reading material still in his cell. And so he just has to sit there all day long with absolutely nothing to do. Gets like 45 minutes of time to exercise a day, and that's it. I mean, it's just unbelievably terrible conditions. And if you want to read through that article, it's pretty long. But, I think if you really want to get an idea for what Julian is probably going through and just kind of what that dehumanizing condition is like, and try to imagine what that would do to your mind if you were locked in a situation like that, it could help to understand why something needs to be done, really soon for Julian Assange. And I do see at least, somewhat hopeful protests still going on outside that prison in the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to add to that, like you said, no reading materials in his cell. And that includes, in fact, like important legal documents to his own case. And I think WikiLeaks even came out with a statement saying that like Assange is being denied meaningful participation in his own case. He can't even look at the documents he needs to and, get in touch with the legal representatives he needs to. So psychologically, of course, the isolation takes its toll, but also for his own legal case, he's, can't really pursue it.
Right. I think about how crazy I would go, sitting in a prison cell in the UK, facing extradition espionage charges, to the US. And at this point, I'm not sure why he would be at least 100% convinced they wouldn't eventually tack on like a potential death sentence to the whole thing. But he's facing this and he can't even do anything about it. He just has to sit there in bots by himself for, most of the day, every day, like 90% of the day, every day. It just seems like an unbelievably, inhumane and, terrible condition to be in, and one that's going to prevent him from mounting any kind of actual defense. Also, what happens to this guy once he does get out? Will Julian Assange ever, be the same WikiLeaks, founder? It's kind of hard to say. Some of this damage isn't reversible. A lot of the findings, of that ProPublica article pointed out that people after they were, in these conditions, solitary confinement for a long period of time were more likely to try to kill themselves. And so they're throwing people in solitary confinement to, prevent suicide. And it turned out it was actually fostering suicide. So, it just seems unbelievable at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I do want to move on to Syria, Will, and I think that's probably the biggest foreign policy news that we have going on. We've talked on the show since Donald Trump did his whole we're moving troops away from the border. Then he called it a withdrawal. Then wasn't a withdrawal. And now we're staying for the oil. But going on in northeastern Syria right now, there are Turkish-backed rebels. These are the Syrian National Army. Right? That's the name of these guys.
Yeah.
And they're, what are they doing up there, Will? And, who were they formerly working for? Who are they working for now? And what's going on with the, kind of civilian Kurdish population.
Yeah. I think this case here with these Turkish-backed rebels, I think it's just a great example of like the hypocrisy and the short-sightedness on behalf of like the media and the politicians and the think tank types, and just how like the narratives justifying war and intervention are constantly changing and contradicting themselves. So I just think that's sort of a good illustrative case. And so in Syria, the story has changed like drastically over the years for like why we're supposed to be there. So first it was all about getting rid of President Bashar al-Assad. Then at some point it became defeating ISIS. That was of course after we flooded the battlefield with weapons, but we'll get to that. Then of course we had to stay there to combat Iranian influence and weapons shipments and to protect Israel. However, now in the short term, the argument that you're hearing from a lot of pundits is that like we have to stay and make sure that our Kurdish proxies are protected from the Turks. And of course, I think the last time I was on, we talked about, the Pentagon's support for the Kurds over the years. Mostly as an effort against the Islamic State. And I think we also covered the Turkish operation, but just sort of to recap, Turkey launched this military operation in northeastern Syria in early October called Operation Peace Spring, where they say they want to push back these Kurdish fighters along the border and eventually like resettle a bunch of Syrian refugees who had fled to Turkey throughout the Syrian war. And of course, Turkey has complained for years and years about the presence of these Kurds in the border areas. And they've actually carried out previous operations against the Kurds as well in the northwestern areas, Operations Euphrates Shield and Olive Branch. And so this newest one, Peace Spring, was just launched in early October. And when it first started, all the pundits were going crazy about the Turkish operation, saying that the U.S. was abandoning our great Kurdish allies. And after the, sort of faux withdrawal that you referred to, where we kind of moved some troops away from the border. And then, I don't know, I think we sent some into Iraq to leave, and then we sent more in to replace them. It's a mess. But nonetheless, the media pundits were going crazy that, oh my God, we have to protect our Kurds. They're about to be slaughtered. However, it's very interesting to look and see who's actually leading that assault on the Kurds. Like, yes, it's the Turks, but like, it's not the Turkish army on the ground actually leading that assault. It's actually a bunch of Syrian mercenaries. And as you suggested, they renamed themselves now to the Syrian National Army. But these militias used to fight under this umbrella called the Free Syrian Army, or the FSA. And this collection of fighters, it might sound familiar because it's the very same group of so-called moderate rebels that the Obama administration had backed for years and actually, poured hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons into. And I think I mentioned this on the last time I was on too. The Syrian National Army even fights under the same flag that the Free Syrian Army did when it was supported by the U.S. So there's like a pretty good a continuity of this group. They're even fighting under the same emblem. Now, though, we're told that these formerly great moderates and the dudes that we had to support a couple of years ago, now they're the thugs and criminals threatening the Kurds with attack at, Turkey's behest. And of course, now I think the description of these Free Syrian Army guys as thugs and criminals is probably more in line with reality, all along. They've always been pretty hardline Islamist groups, varying degrees of jihadist. But now it's just kind of rich hearing these complaints coming from the very people who were so gung-ho about backing the same fighters just a couple of years ago. And the Obama administration really did back these guys to the hilt. Like we've discussed the Arm and Train program on the show before, but the United States, as well as several of its allies, Turkey, Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, France, the UK, all of these countries, led basically by the U.S. operation, helped to arm and train up the Free Syrian Army to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. And the U.S. operation actually ran for a while informally before it was ever actually codified into like a full-fledged program. So in 2012, you actually had the CIA helping coordinate these arms shipments. However, in 2013, they eventually would call this Operation Timber Sycamore. And it would become this huge, costly effort, mostly run through Jordanian border crossings in the south. There's also an operations room in the north in Turkey sending in weapons and fighters. But it was this giant operation to arm and train the moderate rebels in Syria, and those guys largely represented by the Free Syrian Army, the FSA. And that's like the same kind of rebel groups that are leading the assault on the Kurds. But I mean, it was pretty clear from early on that these guys were not moderates, that they were not moderate rebels that we were backing, that there was never really a significant force of moderates to begin with. All along the battlefield was dominated by these jihadist militias. And we've talked about on the show a lot the 2012 DIA memo that pointed out that hey, the Syrian opposition in the east, a Salafist principality might arise from that. And so that's, I think just a very early indication that these Free Syrian Army guys, these moderate rebels were never really so moderate. And I'll let you cut in now, but there's several more examples of how, just how moderate these guys were.
Right. Well, I guess I would just highlight the work of Mats Blumenthal at the Gray Zone, who had a pretty good article on, that 18 of the 21 groups that now call themselves the Syrian National Army were actually recipients of U.S. arms under the Timber Sycamore program, and this included TOW missiles. And so, these are obviously U.S.-backed groups. And so, Will, I guess to me, this raises a whole big question, because one of the main points that I hear from, the people who say, oh, the U.S. betrayed our allies, is that, that we betrayed an ally, when it seems like we have allies in the Syrian National Army, Turkey's a NATO army, and now, apparently betraying the Kurds is the one betraying an ally. Where had we took the side of the Kurds, wouldn't that be betraying a NATO ally, or, the formerly other Syrian rebels that we were arming?
Yeah, I mean, you'd think that Turkey, and I think they are trying to be sort of considerate of, the Trump administration's trying to consider Turkey's position here as a NATO ally. But yeah, it's such a mess. You have right now our former clients, the Free Syrian Army, marching on our prior clients, marching on our current clients, the Kurds, and the former jihadist clients are backed by our NATO ally, Turkey. So it's just it's such a convoluted mess here. But nonetheless, I think there's some pretty blatant hypocrisy going on when without missing a beat, the pundits and the politicians, they don't even acknowledge that we used to back these very same Free Syrian Army guys. They just describe them as killers and thugs assaulting our Kurdish allies. And like they are, like some of the assault that we've seen right now from the Syrian National Army guys has been brutal. Like they've shot some civilians on that roadway. They killed that Kurdish politician. There's like, several sort of what looked like executions in cold blood. It wasn't even like fighting. And so, yeah, these guys are not the greatest dudes, but these were the very guys who, they told us we had to love, that we had to back these, they're just lawyers and dentists and whatever moderate Sunni fighters. But actually, no, I mean, like we see now, like you were mentioning, these various like affiliated rebel groups that were part of the FSA. There's several examples. There's a group called Harakat Nuruddin al-Zinki. And these are the very guys, these dudes were filmed themselves. In fact, their members filmed themselves decapitating this young boy, who they accused of being a government militia fighter, pro-government militia fighter. But he looked like he couldn't have been much older than 14 or something. He looked very young. And that same group, Harakat Nuruddin al-Zinki, was accused of throwing gay dudes off of rooftops, just like ISIS. You had the Al-Farouk brigades who, in 2013, a video of one of their commanders emerged eating the heart of a dead soldier. And he made it like a sectarian thing too. He was obviously that guy was insane, but he also made it my fellow Sunnis do stuff like this to strike fear into the, apostate Alawites, into this other rival religious sect. And so, I don't know, the Syrian opposition all along was dominated by these, hardline Islamist guys. And yeah, we were told that we had to support them, that anyone who was skeptical of Obama's arm and train program was a conspiracy theorist or a kook. But now, again, without even acknowledging it, they, are warning of these same guys, their assault on the Kurds.
Right. I do believe that Al-Zinki video, that kid, I believe he was 16 years old and had signed up for a militia or something like that. But at the same time, this is clearly a terrified young boy who had his head cut off by a bunch of savages. And importantly, as you point out, backed by the United States government. Just a couple other things that I find interesting about, this betrayal of the Kurds was, we talked about on the show when it was first starting up, this whole, kind of joke thing going on that the, one set of US-backed rebels was fighting against another set of US-backed rebels. And this was again these Syrian rebels at the time backed by the United States and not Turkey. And they were fighting the rebels backed by the Pentagon, which were the Syrian Kurds. And why wasn't it betraying the Kurds then? And also, we saw this play out before in Afrin. You talked about Operation Olive Branch, that happens in Afrin, where again, Turkey uses these former Al-Qaeda linked fighters as its rebels to go in, and they commit war crimes and, basically ethnically cleanse the area of the Syrian Kurds.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's not many good guys in this war. A lot of the factions, even the more moderate ones, if you can even call them that, have not been good. But yeah, it ranges all the way to the most hardline Islamist guys who, yeah, Turkey also backs in Idlib.
So elsewhere in Syria, Will, we have this whole staying for the oil business. It seems like, since the last time you talked, me and you have talked on the show, there's been probably about a net total of 100 U.S. troops out of Syria. They're saying about 900 now, including armored vehicles to secure this oil region. Will, do you have any idea if there's any possible way that this could ever be profitable for the U.S. or what the game plan is here? It seems like a very confused policy to me. I was just wondering if you had any insights on it at all.
Well, economically, obviously, it can't make sense. The cost of occupying these oil fields, I don't think can really fully be recouped by the small amount of oil they produce. And I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but as far as I've seen in terms of the barrels per day that these fields can produce, they don't seem to be that lucrative. However, what I do think is that, from the strategic point of view, preventing the Assad regime, if your goal is still to somehow, hurt the Assad regime and somehow, prevent it from recovering or something, then yeah, then keeping them from getting these oil resources, I guess, would make some sense. But I think that policy is outrageous. Why should we be doing that? We should be, I don't know, the longer that Syria stays unstable in a war zone like this, the longer that it takes the Syrian state to, I'm as anti-statist as any, libertarian out there, but nonetheless, I don't know, when we're talking about the security situation, it's better that I think the Syrian state controls it than a bunch of crazy, ISIS militias or, Islamist militias, ISIS allies. So nonetheless, yeah, I think the longer that it takes the Syrian government to regain control over the security situation in Syria, the more instability there's going to be, the more fighting, the more death there's going to be. The United States can only really be a hindrance to that right now. There's really nothing productive the U.S. can do by staying, occupying these oil fields or really any part of Syria. Even the Tanaf base in the south, there's really no productive, thing to gain there. That's more about Iran, I guess, though. But yeah, so I agree that it makes no sense from a financial standpoint, that I don't think we're going to be making money off of this. And nonetheless, I think too that the defense officials have said that we don't even intend to take the oil. It's that we said we're going to be giving it to the SDF, I guess. And so I guess the only thing it could be about would be to prevent Assad from regaining control of the oil fields.
I guess the only thing I could think about is that, this really has to extend the amount of time that even the Assad controlled areas of Syria will be less stable because, this means less revenue for the government. If the Syrian army is able to take this back, then meaningful infrastructure could be rebuilt and, the oil operations can operate again. And then Syria could stop buying oil from, let's say, Iran and, start just using their own oil and maybe exporting some others, generating some revenue for an economy severely in need. This is one of those problems where, of course, the state owns the oil. So yeah, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of theft in it, and more of it will probably end up going to the people it should, than if the U.S. is the one conducting that business. And, I certainly don't like to point the finger first at Israel every single time something happens in the Middle East. But it does seem like only the Israeli policy is really of benefit here, which is to make this conflict go on as long as possible. The U.S. policy, at least from the standpoint of security of the Americans, a Syrian state would prevent another uprising of, ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And certainly, the more Syria is rebuilt, the more refugees that could return there, alleviating, the global refugee crisis some, which seems to be something that the Trump administration Americans would want. So it's really hard to see how this could be of any benefit to the Americans, especially since it's not in any way enough to destabilize or overthrow the Assad regime. In fact, if the United States is occupying pockets of Syria, that seems like something that Assad would use to rally support to his side, if nothing else.
Right. I mean, yeah, and the American soldiers out there just, they're just big red, white, and blue targets too for any not that the Syrian Arab Army is going to march on them, I don't think. Although one U.S. Pentagon official did say something like, if he was asked by a reporter if the Syrian army tries to march and retake those positions because it's their oil, what will you do? And the U.S. basically, the guy said we would fire on them. But so that's kind of crazy. But nonetheless, yeah, I just think by keeping these guys out there, they're a big target for whatever militias in the region want to launch any attacks on them. It's just, it does nothing. I don't know. There's no possible gain from an American point of view. Certainly though, like you said, from the Israeli point of view, I guess, they've stated their policy goal is to just see all sides hemorrhage in the conflict, to see it continue as long as possible, to keep Syria destabilized. Yeah, I guess that would benefit that.
Yeah, and just I guess one last thing I'm thinking about this now is that just all the uncertainty that comes with the U.S. not really having a policy here. Who are we prepared to fight for these oil fields? Well, it seems like if it is little Islamist militia forms over in East Syria and some Arab militants, loyal to al-Nusra try to take it back. Well, it seems pretty obvious that the U.S. will bomb and kill those guys. But what about if, a more recognized, Arab militia, some group of moderates or the Deir ez-Zor governance or whatever tried to, take that, or Assad or Russia or Iranian forces? Who are we willing, prepared to kill for the 4,000 barrels of oil being produced there today? It doesn't seem like anybody has a concrete answer for that. And it certainly has never been a mission authorized by the U.S. Congress.
No, certainly not.
Let's go on to Yemen, Will, because you've been covering Yemen over at RT, particularly U.S. weapons ending up in Yemen. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So recently there's actually a video CNN obtained. I guess sometimes they do, publish some good stuff. But it appears to show a U.S. weapons shipment, being unloaded at the Saudi-controlled port of Aden in Yemen. And in the video clip, you can actually make out pretty clearly like an Oshkosh armored vehicle, like this big, hefty armored truck. And you can see that pretty clearly. Although I think that's like all you can really make out in the clip. And I mean, I don't think there's much reason to expect or to think that U.S. arms shipments had stopped to Saudi Arabia. But it's just interesting to see how, to see it actually happening, where literally the rubber meets the road, where the tires of the armored vehicle meet the road in Yemen. And it's also interesting, in light of the fact that, there are ongoing credible reports that U.S. arms that are sent to the Saudis in Yemen end up with Al-Qaeda linked groups, because Saudi hands out the weapons and armored vehicles to militia fighters that it likes in the war against the Houthis. And oftentimes those militias involved, child soldiers and stuff like that. So it's not great. And so that's been a pretty big issue throughout the conflict, is that, American weapons ending up into the hands of, extremists through Saudis. And there are these things called end user agreements that, of course, the Saudis agree with the U.S. that they won't hand out our weapons to third parties without authorization. And the Pentagon insists that they have not given such authorization to the Saudis to hand out weapons. But nonetheless, we see them, in the hands of these various fighters. And of course, U.S. weapons sold to the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, have also been found in the hands of militia fighters. But the Emiratis seem to prefer the southern separatist guys more than the jihadi elements. And so the U.S. weapons are mostly, I think, passed to those guys from the UAE. I think the UAE still does probably have its hand in backing some kind of, jihadi linked groups, but I think they prefer the southern separatist dudes. That's been like the main, contingent they've backed. But nonetheless, even giving weapons to those guys, it still complicates the situation. Like, U.S. weapons are complicating, this battlefield. Because lately the separatist guys have actually been clashing with the Saudi-backed forces. And at one point, the separatist guys actually had a coup. They staged a coup in Aden where they took over the, government buildings. Aden is the interim capital of the Saudi-backed government, in Yemen. So yeah, just again, U.S. arms are totally inflaming the situation in every way. Not only just within the coalition side with the spat between the Saudis and the UAE, or their backed forces, but also, of course, the terrible air war with U.S. weapons that have been waged on civilians in the whole war against the Houthis for the last 4.5 years. So that also continues.
So, I guess, one of the interesting things I find is that no matter how much weapons the Saudi and UAE side seems to have in this fight, it's not really changing the battlefield. Will, do you have any reason to suggest these weapons or anything that is going on is changing the battle lines at all in Yemen? Or are we kind of looking still at the status quo? I know it's been quite a while on the show since I've gone through and kind of broken down what's happening in Hadada, Sana'a, Sadah, Taiz, Aden. But for the most part, it seems to just kind of be consistent.
Yeah. It seems to be, to me too, a stalemate, basically. Like the Saudis continue their air war. The Houthis continue, launching out, striking out their, drone and missile attacks occasionally. I have not seen really many significant updates to speak of in the conflict in Yemen. I know in October, I read the Saudis were actually holding back channel talks with the Houthis after the Houthis' big attack on those Saudi oil facilities. And the Saudis actually had even said that they would halt their bombing raids for a minute. And the Houthis also said they'd stop their drone and missile attacks. But in the meantime, unfortunately, I've seen reports of bombings and airstrikes and all of the above. The Houthis, I think, just launched a drone attack at a port town in the southwest a couple days ago. And then I saw also reports of Saudi shelling on pro-Houthi forces in a town that's like outside of Hodeidah. So I don't believe that they've lifted, I don't think they've lifted any of the blockades. I don't think they've lifted their bombing campaign. It seems to all be going. I'm not sure what those reports were that suggested there'd be some kind of pause in strikes or a pause in the Houthi drone strikes. Maybe you know more about that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I really don't have anything. Some people really started to draw attention to Trump's tweet last week after there was that agreement signed in Aden between the separatists and the Saudis, kind of giving the Saudis control at that point. And Donald Trump said something like good start, more to go or something like that. And people, because there have been suggestions and reports in the past that the U.S. government was pushing Saudi Arabia for talks, but I don't know about that. I guess I'm pretty skeptical on that one.
Yeah, I saw a bunch of weird, I think the media reaction to that deal between the separatists and the Saudi-backed forces, the Hadi government, I think there was a weird tone-deaf response to that. I saw a bunch of people celebrating that deal as if oh, it's a sign the war might end soon. But it's like, no, that was a dispute within one side of the conflict, and now, if anything, they're just more unified to continue their fight against the Houthis. Like, I guess you could say that they're unified to negotiate an end to the war together, like as one single voice. These multiple sides within the coalition, the UAE and Saudi forces. But I don't know. It seems like it could just as easily go in the other direction. That them making the UAE and Saudis, making nice and making a deal together in Yemen might just unify them in their war against the Houthis. I don't know. I thought that was a weird response to that deal. That like, hey, this might mean an end to the war or something soon, which I didn't think it really signaled that.
No, I agree with you, Will, and as always, that's some really good analysis. Do you have anything else on Yemen other than it seems like the humanitarian catastrophe there is just getting worse? And, as I've been saying since me and you start talking on the show, it's just unbelievable to me that nobody has, stopped this thing. And when I, first started paying attention to this, I guess maybe I was way too optimistic thinking there's no way it's going to be as bad as, Scott Horton and Andrew Coburn are saying, when they're talking on episodes of the Scott Horton show, was that back in 2014, probably right at the end of 2013, 2014, when they're thinking about getting this war underway. And yet that, or maybe it's 2015. I'm off a year. Yeah. And so anyways, that's you just don't think you could end up with a man-made famine, but here we are now, Will, and I guess the only solution, or the very first solution, was for the U.S. to withdraw their support for Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're almost 5 years into this conflict now. It seemed like one of those just like sideshow interventions that like, oh yeah, like there's the main deal in Syria or something. There's like the main thing in Libya, and then Yemen's just like a sideshow. But now this is like one of the major wars that we're intervening in. It's a major conflict that we're part of. And yeah, it seems there's really, unfortunately, I don't know, like no logical end to this. It doesn't seem like, we've said previously, we thought that this thing couldn't have gone this long. And so now it's at the point where it's just like, I don't know then, like I've been wrong about it, about how long it can continue. So maybe it really can just go on indefinitely like this. But I mean, I'd hope not. I'd hope something, we did see, like I referred to, there was some kind of back channel negotiations between the Saudis and Houthis, despite the fact they've continued fighting, maybe that will, lead to something eventually.
All right, well, if you don't have anything else to add on the show today, just tell people where they can find your work.
Yeah, sure. So as Kyle mentioned, I'm a staff writer at RT. I don't get bylines there for my news coverage. However, you can find that stuff on my Twitter feed and my Facebook page. So Twitter you can easily find at WKP ANCAP, ANCAP. And then otherwise, you can check the Libertarian Institute and the blog and the featured articles sections for some of my commentary and analysis. I've got a big author archive at the Daily Sheeple, and I've got stuff at Consortium News and antiwar.com.
All right, well, thanks, everybody, and check out the libertarianinstitute.org for this show.